Hi guys, welcome back to the Average Pundits podcast, your home of all things Premier League. And we have a very exciting episode for you today. As always, I'm joined by Reese. How you doing, Reese?
Hello, thank you for having me back.
Perfect, there we go, guys. And we are joined by the global sport correspondent for the Associated Press, Mr. Rob Harris. How you doing, Rob?
Yeah, well, good. How are you?
Yeah, very, very good. Thank you. Thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedule. We know you're in Lisbon at the moment. You know, the life of a sport journalist, even now, it definitely doesn't slow down for anybody.
First time back out of the country in 5 months.
Wow, that is definitely quite impressive. You know, we're in a bit of a weird situation right now, so it must be good to get back out there and cover some global football.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's really news because normally if we'd be coming out to a Champions League game, there'd be this huge buzz around the place. It would all be branding everywhere across the city. I mean, particularly because it's more like a mini tournament this anyway, with the fact we've got the quarterfinals onwards. But Lisbon just seems so quiet. The airport's quiet. There's none of the usual paraphernalia around. They're not really advertising the fact everyone's in town for the Champions League. Obviously, they don't want fans to be gathering here. So it's lacking that buzz. It's sort of occasionally bumping into sort of journalists from abroad that I know who I haven't seen for some time. And we're sort of then at a sort of slight distance.
Yeah, I was going to say Lisbon is an amazing city, and a city so passionate about football. So it must be very strange not having that usual, typical kind of football buzz going around the place at the moment.
And particularly not having the fans, because they would add to the sense as well that we're at something of note. It's a really significant occasion as well, and it would just give that greater feel. And it's just really sort of it's missing them.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Rob, as one of the world's leading sport journalists, we do want to start off talking a little bit about how you got started in journalism. We know you came up through school in Manchester and you got a degree in politics at the University of York. I mean, as a global sport correspondent now, going from originally a politics degree, that's quite a drastic change. You know, what made you have that jump over to journalism?
Yeah, well, I'd always intended to sort of enter journalism probably. I spent a lot of time at university involved in the student journalism as well, and that was occupying a lot of the time. And I'd never intended to do any sort of media degree, and a politics degree fit what I was interested in, fit what I was actually hoping to study. And then throughout my time at university, getting involved in student media very heavily, and afterwards, fortunately, been able to get some experience in terms of national media straight out of university. That wasn't in sport. Sport was never the aspiration to actually necessarily cover full time. An avid viewer involved in some reporting on it, but I'd never necessarily envisaged myself sort of traveling the world, sort of reporting on sport. I thought maybe more likely ending up reporting on politics actually, or some of big international matters on that side of things. Obviously, a lot of it does cross over actually into sport, which is fascinating. And, my early journalism was very much in news, particularly with the Associated Press as well.
So, with your, journalistic adventures, going from politics into that sort of venture as well, like you starting to get as much experience as possible, and you're just trying to get your depth in there, with the freelancing for the Guardian, back in like what was it, 2004 was it? So what was it like getting into like the professional sort of ways of doing journalism?
Yeah, I mean, I was very fortunate the fact that on the back of student journalism, I was able to pick up some freelancing work at The Guardian as well, which involved actually writing about the media industry itself, which was slightly unusual, and doing some various interviews with figures from the industry. And I suppose I got a sense I was sort of veering away necessarily from sort of, I wanted to sort of be getting into hard news out on the road rather than sort of more featurey stuff. And unfortunately, then I encountered freelancing for the Associated Press, then later in the decade, and started covering various news stories, which would take me to covering terrorist matters, political matters, rapidly responding to breaking news, and to having to sort of try to put it in an international context as well, to sort of explain it to a wider audience, sometimes out of very British matters or more British centric, and it sort of gave me that feel. And then actually on the back of doing that for the Associated Press, they they needed some sport covering. And they needed an England game covering once, of all things, and none of the sports side was around, and I was around and available to do it. And then from that, ended up covering more and more football, and then there were greater sort of issues around football that started to get involved, and we sort of build up then to the 2010 World Cup vote for the 2018 and 2022 World Cups, and all the Liverpool ownership battles that were taking place at the time as well. And I got heavily involved in the reporting on that, the more sort of sports news side of things, and sort of not really looked back from there since, and sort of covering the big sports issues on the pitch and off the pitch.
That is absolutely fascinating. That it kind of like more like fell towards you, but that is really interesting to hear. That, you know, going from, you know, obviously some of those amazing breaking stories going into just like, oh, why would you fancy covering an England game? I think that's quite an interesting way to get involved in kind of the sports market for a bigger you know, organisation like the Associated Press.
Yeah, I mean, it was. I suppose I just never really explored that route fully in terms of, and maybe I needed to sort of do some of that other reporting to sort of get some of it standing in there. And so I'd done it before sort of encountering and moving into the sports reporting. And perhaps it was just a world that I hadn't really seen into to sort of think about, you know, being an avid viewer and actually, you know, covering and promoting sports journalism while I was actually at university as well. So it was always sort of on the mind. And obviously then getting to go to the major tournaments, it would have been something I would always thought about. I thought, you know, I want to get to a World Cup, wanted to get to an Olympics as well. And then the fact it sort of fell into place like that, and also been able to cover so much more than just the on-pitch matters, while being able to sort of do the match report, also being able to sort of end up covering the intersection between sports and politics, when you've got someone like a first Middle East World Cup bid winning, and all the interrelated issues and what it meant to a region that sort of had so many different spin-off issues that continue to this day. And also things like at the Confederations Cup in Brazil in 2013, suddenly it becomes a period of social unrest in Brazil, and you end up sort of covering not only the football, but what it means to Brazil at a time when the streets are full of rioting and lockdowns before we had them now, when whole cities were being boarded up, and there was this real sort of groundswell of public anger that was taking place at the time of a sports event. And you got to sort of bring it to the world's attention through the fact that sport was taking place there, and it actually probably had a greater international resonance because some of the world's best players were actually in Brazil at the time. And then obviously we're back for the World Cup the following year, when it was far quieter actually, and you get to tell more of a human story at places like the Brazil World Cup, the Russia World Cup, where you've got all the thousands of people gathering from across the world, and you realise the whole world it has its eyes on this country at that moment, which means also you're getting to tell stories about Russia as well, which dominated the build up to the Russia World Cup, and suddenly you're reporting on doping scandals, state involvement in corruption, wrongdoing, and you find yourself at the Kremlin, as I was, sort of been approached by the Deputy Prime Minister to sort of challenge me on some reporting.
That is absolutely fascinating. The crossover is absolutely fascinating. It leads me quite on well to my next point. Obviously, you know, the job of a journalist, there are lots of highs and there are lots of lows, you know, with the job. You know, I'm sure you face challenges every single day doing this job professionally. What would you say are some of the best benefits and some of the worst points of being a global sport correspondent?
Well, it's interesting the fact that however much you try to want to engage, and you know, you try to through social media, there can be some who just take it into the extremes, and that can be quite, I was going to say, irritating. It's actually, you know, concerning at times. The fact some small minority of fans might take the interaction to the extremes and just resort to abuse far worse than that as well. And the benefits of being able to engage with fans as well, those who vast majority don't resort to any sort of abuse like that, and you know, you can actually be part of a two-way conversation, whereas obviously in the past journalism would have been quite one way. The fact you're just putting the information out there, you're not really seeing your viewers, you're not seeing your readers. You might get a letter in the post or something like that. But, you know, obviously, you know, through social media, you get this sort of direct connection with what impact your story is having, what interest there is. And also it can feed ongoing reporting as well, because people might approach you with stuff. And also it gives you encouragement, the fact people are interested in the matters. I mean, you see it even with things like FIFA at the moment, whereas 5 years ago with the arrests, a lot of people might have thought FIFA would die down as an issue. It was a new FIFA and it was going to be boring, frankly. And actually what we've seen since then, it continues to produce storylines after storylines, whether corruption or VAR and the decisions that rile people on the pitch as well as off it. And, you know, that interaction means, you know, you're part of a wider conversation. And then just, you know, generally the fact that, you know, you get to try to be the eyes and ears of people for things around the world and try to distill it down, because so many people can obviously watch a match these days. So many people can try to report on a match or do report on games and have their own takes. There's like so many brilliant digital shows around the world as well. People from all parts of the world who have a better view on the game and outlook than often those of us in the stadiums. So hopefully what we've tried to do is try to give that extra, which is, can you sort of deconstruct what's going on in sport and try to explain it and bring it to life, and also try to give those glimpses from behind the scenes of the world of sport as well, to give a sense of how these decisions are taken, who's taking them, and how ultimately these things affect everyone on a day-to-day basis. Because, you know, for so many years I'd go to the what seemed boring IFAB meetings that very few people had little interest or know about, and then suddenly you see in the last sort of couple of years IFAB and things like that are sort of rolling off the tongue for so many people, and they're sort of, you know, directing their fury at every offside towards them. And it's fortunate that I've sort of been able to cover some of that for several years, to sort of have an insight into just to sort of how a sort of tiny sort of body of people who meet in small hotels throughout the year have such an impact on our game. And it's good to be able to be backed by my company, AP, to go to those events for so many years, particularly when it seemed like there was no real decisions of consequence to make. It would be sort of like, you know, discussing handball or something, we'd sort of travel all around just to report on a couple of days of meetings. And particularly at a time like now, it allows me to hopefully try to distill it and break it down to, to fans who don't always have that glimpse into that part of the game.
Yeah, definitely. And you do mention the covering the FIFA arrests, and, you know, sort of having that sort of, it was a really crazy time to be a journalist, and you know, you were one of the few that were able to go and cover that. How chaotic was that to try and like cover? Like, as you mentioned, you know, it could have been something to, you know, the corruption was like something, you know, kind of easy to report, and then it kind of escalated. What was that like, sort of like?
One thing is that it was the ahead of the FIFA elections that week in May 2015, and actually I thought, what's a bit of a way of previewing this thing? So ahead of the arrests, I'd actually done a piece with the outgoing British Vice President of FIFA, Jim Boyce, where he was giving anecdotes about how he's made to feel like a criminal at times on planes, because people sort of see his FIFA connection. So we had this headline that had gone out about, you know, feeling like a criminal when you were a FIFA member. And then obviously in the days later, an early morning call in Zurich informs me of arrest taking place at the Bora Lac, which is this luxury hotel in Zurich where the FIFA members gather and stay, where, you know, actually so often my job as a journalist is just to hang around the hotel lobby and hope to chat to people, and hopefully they will talk to us. So it was a hotel sort of known well, and one that is always a bit sort of uneasy about a group of journalists often just sitting around a hotel lobby at a place that is very costly for even a coffee. And anyway, so I get this call to go down. Fortunately, I was staying very close by in the centre of Zurich to where the FIFA members were. So I was able to run down the street. It was like 6 a.m, very quiet, getting closer and closer. And fortunately, just as I'm arriving at the back of the hotel, one of the FIFA executives is being led out by police with white sheet holding up, quickly sort of go to grab my phone and start recording as I'm sort of approaching the scene, and she seems to be taken into a car. Police sort of put their hand up to stop me recording. I wasn't exactly sure, obviously, Swiss law, what I couldn't be, whereas some countries feel more confident in. And it turned out to be the only video of one of the arrests taking place of what became a monumental occasion. In terms of job-wise, this might be interesting. Some might think the first reaction is to throw it straight out there on social media. One thing I have to do is make sure it goes back to my company first, so they have the chance to be able to put it out to the AP subscribers, broadcasters, newspapers, digital platforms all around the world, so they can put it out, so we can give it to those who are ultimately funding for Moral Right to be there reporting. And I don't think it was so much later in the day, I might have even referenced that I'd even had this footage or anything. And then that day just completely escalates in terms of the severity of it. And it can be quite different when you're witnessing something on the ground versus how people might be watching it unfolding on rolling news. You'll see this sort of drama of a sort of unfolding story with moment by moment developments. When you're sort of on the ground at many of these things, you're sort of in the normal humdrum of sort of the working day, because there isn't stuff always happening around. There are lulls where you're just trying to find out information. So yes, you're on your phones, you're trying to frantically find out information, but physically nothing is happening around you because the arrest took place some time ago. The police car's sort of there statically, but yeah, there isn't a sort of mass frenzy. And then we're sort of waiting to find out what happens. We go to FIFA HQ, where there's this sort of bizarre press conference by the communications chief. Sort of, it's a good day for FIFA, this, because it helps to weed out what they see as wrongdoing. And then obviously we sort of build up to this FIFA election still that takes place with Sepp Blatter being re-elected. The next day he does a press conference, defiant, bold, the fact in bolds and the fact he's being re-elected. And, it's the time when you realise actually there's huge international interest in this. So when you're asking your question, it's going to be watched live around the world. So you've got to make sure it's relevant and hopefully is sort of reflecting what people want to know as well, and the core issues. So that was certainly fascinating. And then obviously it escalates. The fact Blatter himself announces within days that he is actually going to step down later in the year. There's a further sort of moment later that summer. So I think we ended up in St. Petersburg for the World Cup draw, and Blatter was there and acting as normal and still on the international stage. And then obviously within a month he was completely sort of suspended and banned from football. And that was actually a period where I ended up spending a few weeks in Zurich when we were sort of waiting it out to see what the developments would be. That was around the October time, and it's that sort of moment when you're often just sort of sitting around the place waiting for you to sort of working on stuff, but you're sort of there for the just in case something physically happens that you might need to be at. And things I managed to do there was doorstep the Attorney General of Switzerland after he gave a speech in Zurich. When I say a speech, I had to sit through a legal lecture given by him in German at the University of Zurich before, so I could then know when he'd finished to go out to try to get him, which I did. We were talking about the Platini-Blatter case. And obviously we're still sort of, we see the consequence this day because the trials are still ongoing and we're still getting people prosecuted as a result of these arrests. And ultimately it sort of led to so little trust for so many people in ultimately what football is and who's running football. That's a very long answer.
Definitely. I mean, being a journalist, like you do just sort of try to have to be in the right place at the right time, especially when you are like a global correspondent like yourself. You do get the opportunities to go around the world and, be a part of these massive organizations. And during this time, you actually, during your course of the career, you actually got the chance to interview Gianni Infantino, who, he was elected, into FIFA. So what was he like to talk to?
Yeah, we sort of move on then from the Blatter era to the new era at FIFA. Yeah. And Gianni Infantino was someone that I'd encountered a lot at UEFA. Interestingly, it was September 2015, just before the allegations came out against Platini that brought him down, and I was in Malta for a UEFA meeting. Which sounds, unfortunately, like sort of a tour around glamorous locations. And it was one of those where the UEFA members were all meeting for talks over the future of the game, what should happen. And it was one of those I raised my company saying, I'm not really sure it's necessarily worth going to this because not a lot might go on. Anyway, I get there, and basically the only English language journalist there, which means that I'm able to actually get a few stories. Actually, one of them was someone came out of the meeting saying, there's a plan for a third European competition, which is obviously now going to be the UEFA Nations League. And anyway, so the annoying thing that week was Platini wasn't talking at all to the media. Yeah, the only time he'd talk was, standing around at the bar, and he'd complain about how bad, or be quite pleased how bad English teams are doing it in the Champions League. Anyway, so it came to the press conference, and it was done yet again by his administrator, Gianni Infantino. And I think he probably knew I was going to ask this because we've spoken about why Platini isn't doing any media. And I said, why are you here and not the president? Why have we got you, basically? Can't we ask the boss? And then within months, he's running the show. And I got to do his first long-form interview after being elected at FIFA HQ. And we sat down to discuss what was, his early stages of trying to change FIFA. So I interviewed him again, during the election as well before then, and obviously sort of several times since then. And it's interesting, obviously, he never expected necessarily to be elected president. He might have had ambitions to be president at the back of his mind, but there wouldn't necessarily be a path to that happening because Platini was clearly the heir apparent to Blatter. So he ends up in this almost unbelievable situation where he's suddenly got the world's leaders all welcoming him, from Putin to Trump to the Saudi leadership as well, to all around the world. Suddenly on the international stage is this quasi-political figure. In fact, he enjoys the fact he's invited to these big political gatherings as well. He was in Davos in January. He introduced Trump at a dinner, and it's been interesting sort of to follow his sort of progress and how he is when he's giving a speech or is next to a world leader, and how he is when he's back within a small group of us, or you're just conversing or interviewing in a one-to-one situation. And he must even reflect sometimes. It's pretty remarkable how suddenly he is this global figure, whereas when he was first elected, I sort of had this name recognition, I was sort of wary of. Everyone knew who Blatter was. Everyone, a lot of people knew who Blatter was. Many people, most of them, knew who Platini was. When you're writing a story, does Infantino's name travel? I'd often say, as the face of the Champions League draw, to try to remind people how they might know this name of the person suddenly appearing in stories. Whereas now, obviously, which shows us about the power of football, on immediate reference to Infantino, people know who you're talking about. His voice carries weight, and his comments are deliberated on as well, in a way that a lot of people around the world, general sports fans, wouldn't be able to name some of the heads of other sports, which actually is something we do question at times, whether football does disproportionately get the scrutiny, because actually some sports are run absolutely, terribly in terms of their Olympic sports, even that have their moments at the Olympics. But there's so many questions around the management. There's been big investigations, weightlifting, swimming's had allegations as well. But it just shows the power of football, the fact that actually the world is interested, hopefully so, when we sort of reporting on and scrutinising the football leadership.
Yeah, you touch on Olympics there as well. We know that you've covered so many big things as a global sport correspondent. Obviously, mainly focusing on football as kind of a specialty, but you've covered a lot of stuff in your career. What was the England, the England kind of opportunity, the first real opportunity you've had of sport journalism, or was there anything before potentially? Like, what was the first defining moment for you?
I mean, I'd got to be around the Commonwealth Games in 2002. So that was, I wasn't sort of new to sort of seeing what it's like at a major tournament. So it was great to do. And ended up sort of covering England at World Cups and Euros as well, at the last World Cup. So I'm trying to remember, 2018 was the last England tournament now, because obviously we should have spent this summer at the Euros. And at the Russia World Cup, I got to go to all of their games up to the semi-finals. And, you realise, wow, this is, it's interesting, because a lot of the world is really interested in the team, as well as it being big, obviously, back home. I would cover more of their training camps at previous sort of tournaments and sort of press conferences, but I sort of actually fortunately had the chance to sort of just go around the country more in Russia and do other teams and experience other things, rather than being in sort of enclosed England environment where you're sort of covering them on a day-to-day basis in every sort of cough and spit, every storyline from there. But then, the opportunities to do Olympics as well. London 2012, that was my first Olympics and Paralympics, which is obviously dominated the build-up as well. The fact, seeing how things are being built, and then the planning for the games, and then the post-games legacy as well. And then my next one after that would have been Sochi in 2014, which is still resonating to this day, because just this week I in the last week done an interview with Grigory Rodchenkov, the Russian doping whistleblower who was involved in the scheme to cover up doping tests. He created the Duchess cocktail of steroids that helped to deliver all those Russian medals with the athletes cheating. And I interviewed him again in the last week about the plot and the deception and the cover-ups and the spying and the like. And we even talked about how I'd been back to his old anti-doping lab in Sochi, which is now a bar where they serve Duchess and B-sample cocktails. A place I had to visit when I was in Sochi for a pre-World Cup meeting a couple of years ago. And the reason I ended up in Sochi was for the Paralympics of 2014. And that was a late trip where Russia had annexed Crimea between the Olympics and the Paralympics. So it was seen as worthwhile to beef up our reporting at the games, to go out to see what the fallout would be from the fact that Russia was hosting now the Paralympics while involved in this huge international dispute because of the annexation of Crimea. And so it was an opportunity in Sochi to report on the political fallout, the protests by Ukrainian athletes on the podium, and also some of the some of the actual events at the Paralympics, some of the features, some of the news, some of the events going on, and being able to go to things like when Vladimir Putin was hosting a lunch of Paralympic leaders, that I was asked to go along, actually, which was quite unusual. To remember the image that sticks to mind of him toasting champagne glasses, denying any involvement in Russian, annexing Crimea at all, while obviously Crimea was only about 200, I think it was only about a few hundred miles away from Sochi on the Black Sea. So it was fascinating to cover that. The next games after that was the Rio Olympics, which actually obviously a lot of British success, which was interesting because for once working for an international organisation, everyone was interested, a lot of people were interested in how Team GB were doing, and it was a good chance to report on that. And then I was also covering a lot of IOC matters in terms of how the International Olympic Organisation was being covered. And then actually we had one day when there was an arrest of an Irish member of the IOC at their hotel in a ticketing scandal. And I'd gone down to the hotel, and while I was outside seeing what was going on, a FIFA executive passed by, which basically delighted to commenting, "It's good job it's not us today."
Oh, that must have been quite surreal to hear that coming past things. And God, it's not us.
Oh, the things that you get, being a journalist. Oh, that's amazing. Like, so with the events that you've covered, like, what would you say is the best event that you've ever covered? Like, throughout your entire career, what stands out as the best?
Well, it's an interesting one. I mean, obviously, some of the news events at the moment, you really want to be there because you know that the world is interested. So ones that people wouldn't necessarily put it down to. So a lot of people would think it's about the travel, it's getting to go to all these places. The fact you actually, when you're at the World Cup or event, you buy the Copacabana every day, you can wander down there. So, there's the two sides between getting to see places and getting to meet people, and also you want to be at the heart of the story. Things like the Russia World Cup were fascinating because we got to go around a country that we're not regularly visiting. So I got to visit cities that perhaps wouldn't be on the normal tourist trail. Perhaps, you know, one of the reasons is because obviously you do need a visa to go to Russia, so maybe that actually is an extra barrier to tourists going there. And there'd been so much interest, obviously, in the country and how we report on it. And what we never sort of said was Russia was a, you know, not an interesting place to go around, as a chance to actually visit all these places: Kaliningrad, Volgograd, Nizhny Novgorod, Kazan, Sochi, St. Petersburg, Moscow, you know, all these sort of cities that I've had a chance to go to. And what I was trying to do as well, obviously, while going to these places, I was sort of trying to bring them to light for the world. So at the time I was doing an AP podcast, so I'd take that around these various places, recording some segments in Stalin's bunker in Samara one day, and to go around all these different places, eat the food, see the experiences. Now, of course, it doesn't take away from the fact that there were many questions over Russians hosting the tournament. And I thought it was fascinating, the fact that I was in the stadium for the final in Moscow, and TalkSport asked me to go over to their position. We spent sort of 15 minutes, myself and Mark Saggers, reflecting on, yes, it's been a great tournament, but actually, you know, these are still the issues that go on. There are still the questions over Russia's actions on the international stage, you know, poisoning, annexations, invasions, you know, all those things, the doping scandals. But also at the same time, we can sort of acknowledge that for a few weeks they have flicked a switch. They've relaxed things, and you know, fans were able to gather around freely, drinking in the street, even, which obviously even in the UK would be clamped down on potentially in certain places, and you know, gave this sort of chance. And then on top of that, obviously, we get this great England success, reaching the semi-finals. That was so unexpected, which is, you know, adds to a sort of better atmosphere in and around England delegation, England media pack as well, that I'm sort of in and out of. So and also we're sort of knowing how much of the world back home is sort of focused on these places. And also, you know, sitting in Samara for the quarter-final, and it was a stadium, you know, on the outskirts of town, pretty quiet around the outside, you know, there were fans around. But back home, obviously, I'm sort of sitting in a stadium watching the sort of beer thrown in the air, the mass scenes of joy. And it is true, there is a sense where it's great to be there, but I think probably the fans don't realise necessarily always back home. Actually, the collective communal experience back home is probably as much of a sort of experience, perhaps even better than being in the stadium. I suppose it depends who you're actually with in the stadium. And, you know, some tournaments where you've got absolutely tens of thousands of fans, obviously it's a different feel. But it didn't quite have the same drama when it's a sort of Sunday afternoon in Samara. But actually, it's fascinating to be in Samara because, you know, you get to go to places like the Space Museum and all these sort of different sort of things. I'm sure many fans who are there get to have these sort of unique moments as well, being there. So yeah, I mean, it's you know, it's interesting when you sort of try to reflect on the various sort of places that I've actually got to go to and seen. I mean, going to Rwanda for 3 days for a FIFA meeting 2 years ago, it, you know, was absolutely fascinating to do, because obviously, you know, going around the centre, there's not not a lot of tourists around necessarily, particularly in October, and you know, getting, you know, dipping out of a country like that was, you know, some of the places that, you know, you might not necessarily get the chance to go to, but for but through work.
Absolutely fascinating, honestly. It's so interesting hearing, you know, as journalism students, hearing about all the travel side to it, because obviously we're very early doors in. It's only something we can hope to strive to. But lastly, we just wanted to ask, you know, as someone in your position, is there any advice that you would impart on young aspiring journalists to try and, you know, to push the boat out and to try and get to, you know, potentially where you are today?
Yeah, I mean, it might sort of give the impression of sounding like sort of like globetrotting the whole time, and it always does wear my mind actually justifying being in this place and making sure you're delivering value for your company and actually not making it seem like a holiday. Sometimes it might sort of seem actually constantly sort of like online and working as well, and sort of wanting to sort of be there for, you know, trying to push out a lot of content. And I suppose hopefully the reason for sort of getting that, and it's part of the advice, is trying to have something that sort of sets you apart in some way, and something that you might be known for covering, or an area, and that can be a type of interview you do. It can be language skills that get you certain interviews or get you particular knowledge of a certain country, or knowing one particular team very well or one particular element. Some people have made a lot of expertise out of covering transfer stories. I tend to do fewer of those just because it's quite time consuming, and some transfer stories can appear wrong in public so they don't come to fruition, but it actually often is the complications of it, and it's how much time to sort of devote to all those. So it tends to be more focused on the bigger club ones, and also trying to sort of find areas that interest you, and hopefully exploring parts of the game that pique your interest, and exploring little sort of tips and things like that. I mean, one happened fairly recently. Not a huge interview, it got some sort of a line, and it was the head of the committee on the return of elite sport that I spoke to, and he gave me the line after interviewing him. The line came through the interview. In fact, it could be a year away still from full stadiums, a whole season, Premier League without full stadiums, for instance, and talking through the process. Now, his name hadn't been in public before in terms of any interview. It was actually his name I spotted as one line low in an article, probably in around May, that he was involved in these talks with the Premier League. So I contacted him, and he couldn't really talk at the time because he was involved still in the talks with the captains, the managers, and about the return of play. And eventually he contacted me, we've been in contact, saying, actually, I can talk now. And it's all just I spotted this one line in an article that he was someone involved in the talks. So I thought, he might be interesting to talk to. And it just led to something down the line. And it reminded me of some other piece of advice that I heard once a few years ago. Someone said, often the best things that you can sort of expand into stories or features can be buried in the news and briefs column. Just something that might happen to be dismissed as a small issue or a local issue that actually you can draw something more out of. And you probably see that with how certain papers might take on an issue that they see as important, whether it's Windrush with The Guardian, and you really sort of push on that and sort of delve ever deeper. So, you can hear other people in the media sort of say something isn't a story, or that's not really an issue, or even the other thing, that's a bit of a local issue. Often you can draw something out to be far more significant, whether it's through the human interest angle, bringing a story to life through personal experience. As you sometimes see with foreign media, from like the New York Times, even producing within a matter from England, just by it gets attention to the way they bring what might seem a local issue, to life with a sort of greater angle. So yeah, it's always just trying to sort of find something distinctive, hopefully.
Absolutely fantastic. Rob, thank you so much for being on this week's podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
No problem. It's been great talking, and hopefully some of the answers weren't too rambling. So things like podcasts and tweets are when people see and hear journalists without subs editing any of our copy.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating to hear because, like you said, it gives us a chance to sit down and find out about the person behind the accounts, behind the articles, because there's so many stories to tell there. And we will link your social media in the bottom of this video. And if you want to get involved with us, you can find us on Instagram at The Average Pundits, on Twitter at Pundits Average. And if you want to get involved with us to potentially be on the podcast, we are available at theaveragepundits@outlook.com. Reese, as always, thank you for joining me as well.
It's been a pleasure to talk to be joined by you, Joe, and also to be joined by such an established journalist like Rob. And you're just kind of to pick the brain of a guy that, someone that we kind of aspire to be. Like, me and Joe, we always, like, doing this course, we aspire to be in your position. So it was, really eye-opening to actually get to know you and get to know your story as well. So thank you.
It's been great chatting, because I think, one of the main things as well as journalists is not sort of thinking what we're doing now as well is the way it should always be. And there's always fresh ideas, fresh talent coming through.
Absolutely brilliant. Well, thank you very much for watching, guys, and listening, and we will see you next time.